Let's face it, this issue is controversial and political. So we can't ignore these aspects, even though we can address it initially from an actuarial standpoint. We should be mindful of all the other ramifications surrounding this issue. The topic of Chapter 3 is assessing the fairness, particularly of a social or social security program. And I emphasize the word fairness, which is the basic topic of this chapter. In considering making changes, which most countries are in one way or another, several factors have got to be considered. First, one that's the immediate concern, or I take that back, long-term concern, is sustainability, which has been mentioned and will continue to be mentioned in this area. On the other hand, of course, to be sustainable, well, all you got to do is reduce the benefits. Well, but then on the other hand, you'll have to look at what the objectives of the program are in the first place. So therefore, you've got to be concerned with the adequacy of the benefits provided. The third is based on, you've got a context, an economic, political, social context, which is you develop a set of societal expectations. So therefore, in terms of assessing a program, you look at what those expectations are or what you hope they will be. And the last one, which is sometimes not as considered as greatly as the others, is equity and fairness. The last item on this slide is the need to periodically review. This is not a static issue. We have to make sure that we realize that this is dynamic, affecting people's lives. But I'd like to focus on this in terms of this issue is on a holistic basis. I know it's an overworked term, looking at things holistically, but I think this is an important one. As I mentioned, it affects people's lives. In terms of this, I think I consider this to be 6 pillars. There used to be typically 3 pillars. Now I think there's even more that we've got to consider. First, the basic part of this, which is Social Security benefits. But in addition, in terms of that adequacy factor, there is a safety net, or some societies call it welfare benefits. Third, which has been a backbone, at least over the last 50, 60 years, is employer-sponsored programs. But boy, that might not be sufficient for everyone in terms of their financial expectations. So therefore, you've got to consider personal savings, of which a significant element is owned housing. Well, as longevity occurs, continues to lengthen, which is obviously a good thing. At least most people consider that a good thing. The factor of current and future wages have to be considered. But the original solution to this prior to a century ago was the family and community. And this is something that also should be considered in some way. Which brings back to the topic of fairness. When I first started getting involved in risk classification issues in the 1980s, this was a word that was silent. People, actuaries, politicians really want, people and analysts, whether they be actuaries, economists, et cetera, stayed away from that term. They say it's something it's political, highly charged, and it's an advocacy word, because if you wanted to push a particular position, well, you'd say this is fair to my group, or to me, or to my family, community, et cetera. But I don't think we can ignore it. But fundamentally, fairness is a personal concept, and it's a relative, not an absolute one. So I think we have to realize when we discuss fairness that these things are involved, and it reflects the viewpoint and societal expectations with respect to those groups. The topic, though, and we formally consider here, is what we have referred to in the paper as actuarial fairness, sometimes referred to actuarial neutrality. But it's with respect to the equivalent cost in expected value terms. In other words, we're not trying to specifically to motivate or provide incentives for the individual, because they've got to consider their actions based on their best interests, which they will. The ultimate conclusion on any assessment is based on a weighting of group needs and values, although clearly influenced by individual ones as well. A topic that we have to think about as we go along is how to quantify it. We can utilize subjective feelings about what seems fair, but it's useful also to develop some metrics and some measures to try to compare us because it's a relative concept. Listed here four possible metrics. The most common one, I think, is replacement ratios, which is good in a sense, but it's also politically charged. In the US, this is an issue which a year ago was taken out of the Social Security Trustees Report, and delegated and relegated to actuarial note. These are things that need to be considered in assessing potential changes. And replacement ratios, not just for the average, but for the segments or the groups of individuals affected. Money's worth comparison, there's been a lot of challenges, problems with money's worth. That is, what's the personal return on your contributions that you've made over your lifetime? It's fraught with challenges because when you start looking at what the money's worth issues are, you get to the individual assessment or viewpoint. And I don't think we can do that effectively in assessing a change in the program. So we've got to look at it in broad groupings and what's the money's worth for those population segments. Also, relative to expected benefits, sustainability, adequacy, and fairness. Last is affordability. And that gets into the political issue of what do you want to contribute, or what does society want to contribute. Briefly going over benefit adequacy, it's again, in assessing a Social Security program, it's relative to the needs of groups and not to the individuals. If you looked at, it's useful to look at a minimum, and one example is a means-tested program or best set of benefits, but then you get fraught with other issues, and which tend to be more political. The important feature, though, of benefit adequacy is when to start benefit payments, which is the topic of our report, which deeply gets into the longevity risk. I know one actual organization delved into this about the various aspects and viewpoints of longevity risk, but in terms of the longevity risk to the program, that's sustainability, longevity risks to the individual, that is outliving your finances, is an important consideration. I added the last point, which is if you've got an account, personal accounts, defined contribution programs, some countries have developed ability to withdraw some of those funds for current needs. That's highly risky, but it's still a controversial issue that should be considered. When we talk about actuarial fairness, there's two aspects of it. One is intergroup, and the second one is intergenerational fairness. Ideally, you should be providing these benefits according to the needs of the individuals. That's why we add social welfare or safety net programs. If you were to do this, you would consider individuals or groups' standards of living, their health status, their financial resources. What other resources, what other support do they have? Other family members, community support. But we can't do that in a social security program. So therefore, we have to realize that there's trade-offs. Trade-offs in terms of the fact that population groups have different longevity, morbidity profiles. And there are specific groups that have specific needs. Just saw a report that came from the US early this week that said that examined these distributional aspects, and what the point that paper made is that these factors or these groupings are nice and easy to list, but not so easy to actually determine on an eligibility basis. Nevertheless, I think it's an important consideration. One aspect, which is the intergenerational aspect, is also an important one, which we have to recognize. And if, in fact, the primary cause for sustainability issues is changes in expected longevity, then in fact that almost leads you to the conclusion that an appropriate and an actually fair approach is to increase the eligibility age. When financial sustainability is at risk, and if the primary cause is longer longevity, then actuarial neutrality would lead you to the conclusion that you should be providing actually neutral or fair relative benefits and start point by changing the eligibility age. But on the other hand, you've got considerations of inter-subgroup fairness, that is within a cohort, that society needs to consider not necessarily the alternatives, but in terms of the supplementary actions that are needed to go on, which I think plays into the point that I made earlier, which is society has got to look at this in a holistic basis, identify what are the key issues on a group for various groups, and at least consider their implications, which leads me to the conclusion and leads me to Martin.